Somewhere in the Czech Republic, there is a castle with no kitchen, no moat, no water source, no arrow slits facing outward, no place to sleep that makes any logical sense whatsoever. The defensive walls face inward, the thickest stone, the most fortified windows, all of it aimed at the courtyard, not at an enemy approaching from the outside, at whatever was already inside. The chapel sits directly over a hole in the ground, a hole that no one has ever successfully measured the bottom of, a hole that, in the 13th century, the Bohemian crown decided the only rational solution was to build an entire medieval castle on top of it and hope that God and several tons of Gothic masonry were enough to keep whatever was down there from crawling out. And here is the part that should keep you up tonight. It is still there. The hole is still there, sealed under a chapel floor. In an operational building in 2024, the reason no geologist has drilled through to measure it isn't because it isn't because of bureaucracy red tape. It's because the Nazis mined the foundation on their way out. I want you to sit with that for a second. Welcome back to the Phantom Navigator. I'm your host, and tonight we're going into the deep end. We're talking about buildings, bridges, staircases, fortresses, structures that humans built, or supposedly built, that the laws of physics, engineering, and basic common sense says should not exist. Tonight's episode is about one very specific very terrifying idea. What if some of the most famous structures in the human history were built by something that wasn't human? Yeah, Adam, that is crazy. Welcome in. Good to see you. It is crazy. And more importantly, what if some of them were built to keep something in? I have been down a research rabbit hole for this one that genuinely disturbs me. And I do not say that lightly. I have done episodes on serial killers, on mass disappearances, on ritual sacrifice, but something about this topic, something about the idea that the walls around you might have a purpose that you were never meant to know about. Hits differently. So buckle in. We have a lot of ground to cover, and some of it goes very, very deep underground. Let's start with a question nobody asks in architecture school. What does a building look like if its only job is to trap something? Not to shelter humans, not to project power, not to honor a god, just to serve as a lid, a cork, a cage with a very elaborate ceiling. Because when you start looking at the historical record through that lens, a frightening number of structures start to make a horrifying kind of sense. Hoska Castle in Czech Republic. Hoska Castle was built between 1253 and 1278 by order of the Bohemian king Otakar II. Let's run through that standard checklist of medieval castle designs and see how it scores. Strategic location? No. It's in a dense, swampy forest with no military value, no nearby roads, no trade routes. Garrison capacity? No kitchen, no latrines, no wells, no food storage. You couldn't sustain a fighting force in this building for a week. defensive capability, here's where it gets interesting. A standard medieval castle is oriented outward. You build thick walls with battlements, arrow slits, and kill zones facing the approaching enemy. Every design decision is about repelling a threat coming from outside the perimeter. That is medieval military architecture 101. Huska's exterior walls are flat, smooth, featureless, no battlements. The outer skin of this castle gives zero tactical advantage to anyone trying to defend it from the external assault. But the interior is fortified like a maximum security prison. Heavy defensive windows facing inward towards the courtyard, reinforced stone structures not pointed at the forest, pointed down towards the ground, towards what's below. In the center of that courtyard, beneath the castle chapel, is a limestone fissure, a crack in the earth that descends into total, lightless darkness, a hole that pre-Christian Bohemian locals described as so active, so loud, so terrible that half animals, half human entities allegedly crawled out of it at night. The chapel was built directly over it. The chapel floor is functionally a massive stone capstone, and the walls of that chapel are covered in 13th century frescoes that I need you to understand are completely unlike anything else in medieval European religious art. No triumphant Christ, no serene Madonna, no angels with harps. What you get on those walls is a left-handed centaur archer. And if you know what medieval iconography, you know that left-handedness in that era was explicitly the mark of a sinister, the infernal, the wrong side of the veil. The Latin word for left is sinistra. That is not a coincidence. You also get bound entities, creatures with animal heads, pinned beneath the weight of geometric stone arches, crushed into submission by the architecture itself. Someone was very deliberately putting those images on those walls. Someone who wanted whatever was below the floor to know exactly what was happening to it. Now, here's where the story takes a sharp left turn into the 20th century. World War II, the Nazis. The SS Annenerby was Heinrich Himmler's personal occult research bureau. These were the guys who sent expeditions to Tibet looking over the origins of Aryan race, who excavated Arthurian sites in Germany, who believed with complete institutional sincerity that the physical world contained hidden supernatural infrastructure that could be weaponized. The Anernerby took over the Huska castle during the occupation. They didn't use it as a barracks. They didn't use it as a command post. They moved somewhere in the neighborhood of 140,000 stolen manuscripts, occult text, witchcraft trial records, alternative physics documents from across occupied Europe into the castle's subterranean rooms. And then they started digging. Specifically, they started excavating beneath the chapel floor, targeting the exact coordinates of the sealed pit. They were trying to measure it, maybe open it, maybe harness whatever they believed was leaking upward from it for over 700 years. We don't know what they found because when the Soviet Army advanced in 1945, the SS destroyed their research records, all of them. And then, before they fled, they heavily mined and booby-trapped the foundation. The subterranean limestone fissures beneath the chapel, they sealed their own research in the one place they were most convinced contained something real. This is why there has been no modern geological survey of the Houska pit. It's not forbidden by some ancient mystical edict. It's because the most fanatical occultists of the 20th century took the secret to their graves and left the unstable 80-year-old explosives as the footnote. The castle is still standing. It's privately owned. You can visit. The hole in the ground is still there, and if you lay your ear flat against the chapel's stone floor on a still night, and I'm pulling this directly from the staff at the Houska, who refused to be in that room alone after dark, you don't hear the shifting rock or groundwater or the wind. You hear scratching, rhythmic, wet, like something with very large claws is slowly, patiently testing every seam in that stone, looking for the one weak point the medieval masons might have missed. They've been at it for 750 years. They are not in a hurry. And from what I know with limestone, people used to use limestone to keep energy in. So it also believed that limestone can keep energy in. So that's one of the reasons it being built with limestone also fascinates me. Let's go above ground for a minute. In 1267, to East Lothian, Scotland, and man history calls Sir Hugo de Giffard, though his neighbors had another name for him, the Wizard of Yester. Hugo was a brilliant man, an advisor to King Alexander III, educated, wealthy, powerful, and deeply pathologically frustrated with human workers. Human builders were slow. Their geometry was imprecise. They went on strike in winter. They asked to be paid. So Hugo, according to records that the church found troubling enough to preserve, secured a different kind of contractor. For 3 consecutive nights, a dense, sulfurous fog rolled in from the Scottish moors and engulfed the Yester estate. Locals described hearing sound, not like construction, but like thousands of tiny metal hammers hitting stone at an inhuman speed. And underneath that sound, a low, rhythmic chanting that reportedly caused cattle in the surrounding fields to simply fall over dead. On the 4th morning, the fog cleared. Hugo unveiled his masterpiece. He had built a massive, subterranean, Gothic, vaulted hall carved directly into the bedrock of the Scottish earth. It's still there. It's called the Goblin Hall. The Goblin Hall. When you go into the Goblin Hall today, and it's been surveyed, it's been photographed, the first thing architects notice is its stonework. It is flawless in a way that defies the timeline. The rib's Gothic vault is perfectly proportioned. The acoustic environment inside the hall is described as pressurized. Dead silent in a way that isn't natural. Sound pooling in the center of the room rather than traveling outward. The second thing you notice is that the floor leads to a staircase at the far end. It goes down. Not toward an exit, not toward a cellar, straight down into the bedrock, narrowing as it goes. Not a tactical escape route. It has no ground level exit. No practical purpose. It was built to go down into the earth and nothing else. Hugo warned his servants that the iron reinforced door at the back of the vault did not lead to a wine cellar. It was, he said, the threshold. The exact point where his workforce had entered from, wherever they came from. When Hugo died under what the court records call mysterious circumstances, the village elders went down into the hall with sledgehammers. They didn't just lock the door, they spent weeks hauling raw, unquarried stone down those stairs, breaking up the gateway until it was completely flush with the wall. Completely invisible. The wall is still there. Whatever Hugo built the door for, whatever came through it, is either still sealed inside or found another way home. I'd like to believe the second option. I just can't prove it. Tosca is a lid. The Goblin Hall is a threshold. Let's talk about the third type of supernatural structure, the ones built to do a job. Across France, Italy, Germany, and Wales, there are dozens of medieval stone bridges explicitly named the Ponts du Diable, the Devil's Bridges. And they share a blueprint so consistent, so structurally specific that it stops being folklore pretty quickly. Here's the template. A human builder has an impossible problem. A gorge too wide, a river too violent, a canyon that no amount of scaffolding and human labor can span. Multiple attempts have failed. The builder is ruined. In desperation, or very specific moment of suicidal clarity at the edge of an abyss, the builder invokes the devil. But the terms are simple. You build the bridge, I give you the soul of the first living being to cross it at dawn. The contract is signed. The bridge appears overnight. Always overnight. Now, here's what is fascinating about these structures from a purely engineering standpoint. Medieval humans' bridges used semicircular arches, required extensive central scaffolding, and multiple support pillars driven into their riverbed. These bridges almost universally feature something different. A single sweeping parabolic arch. One span, no central pillars, no scaffolding marks. The load distribution requires calculus that wasn't formerly available to rural European builders. And they don't fail. Many of these bridges have survived catastrophic floods that wiped out modern concrete infrastructure. The Ponte di Diavolo at Lanzo Torinese in Italy, built in 1378, never cracked, never settled. The standard exit clause, of course, is the animal trick. The builder sends a dog or cat across at dawn instead of a person. The devil gets the animal's soul, screams in fury at the loophole, and vanishes. In most of the legends, he leaves a mark, a fracture on the keystone, a permanent dent on the spine of the bridge. Despite the structural damage, despite the missing stone, despite the infernal tantrum, the bridges remain standing. But I want to tell you about the darkest version of this story, the one that doesn't end with the animal trick. The Rackotsbruck, Germany, built in 1860, the Kromla Park by a knight named Friedrichs Hermann Rotesk. The bridge wasn't built to connect two banks. There was no road on either side. There was no foot traffic it needed to accommodate. It was built to create a perfect circle. The arch of the bridge is built from a jagged, imported volcanic basalt columns. When the water of the lake below is still, the bridge and its reflection in the water form a geometric circle so perfect that it doesn't distort from any angle. In esoteric architecture, a perfect circle with no beginning and no end is a portal, a mirror to another realm. Specifically, in the European tradition, a crossing point for infernal entities. Roth also erected what he called the Devil's Organ alongside the bridge. Volcanic basalt columns arranged like the pipes of a church organ, designed to play the sounds of the wind for the entity reigning over the lake. The bridge has no safety rails, the path over it made of deliberately jagged, uneven stone. It was not designed for humans. The German government had banned anyone from walking on it. It stands permanently empty, waiting. I find that detail, the empty bridge, the architectural invitation, the fact that most precisely engineered structure in the park is one explicitly built for something other than human feet. I find that generally one of the most unsettling things I've encountered in all the research I've done for this show. We built a lot of things for ourselves. We assumed everything we built is for ourselves. The Ratobrüsk is a formal reminder that we have not always been the intended audience. Here's where we pivot. Because so far we've been talking about structures whose purpose is demonic, containment, thresholds, gateways, architecture as spiritual infrastructure. But there's a second category that might actually be weirder, and that is this. What happens when the human being receives a blueprint from something external? When the math that produces a structure is simply beyond what the person building it could have known. What do you do with a staircase that shouldn't work? What do you do with a castle wall that was built by one sick man working alone in the dark? The Loreto Staircase, New Mexico. 1878, Santa Fe, New Mexico. A group of nuns, the Sisters of Loreto, have just finished building a beautiful Gothic Revival chapel. And there's a problem. The architect died before he could finish the job. Specifically, before he solved the problem of how to get up to the choir loft, 22 feet above the main floor, no staircase, no ladder installed, and a space so small that every carpenter and engineer they brought in said the same thing. It is mathematically and spatially impossible to build a staircase here without altering the building's footprint. So the nuns did what nuns do. They prayed. A 9-day novena to Saint Joseph, the patron saint of carpenters. On the 9th day, a man arrived bearded, on a donkey. He had a hammer, a saw, and a T-square. He offered to build the staircase on one condition. He must be left completely alone. Doors locked, no assistance, for months. The nuns agreed. Months later, they unlocked the doors. The man was gone. No payment collected. No forwarding address. No record of his name in any account book. And in the center of the chapel, a staircase. Now I need you to understand what this staircase is, basically, because the description alone should make your skin crawl. A standard spiral staircase has a central support pillar, a newel post, a whole thing wrapped around this vertical spine, the way a vine wraps around a fence post. Without that spine, the structure collapses. Basic engineering. The Loretto staircase has no central support pillar. It is a perfect helix making two complete 360-degree rotations, 720 degrees total, rising 22 feet in the air. It is touching the wall at exactly one point at the bottom and one point at the top. That is it. That is the entire structural connection to the building. What it is, functionally, it is a compressed wooden spring, a slinky. And like a slinky, when people walk on it, the entire structure doesn't bend under the weight. It flexes and recompresses vertically. The nuns who first used it described it as bouncing slightly, swaying alive in a way that wood is not supposed to be alive. And yet, no splinters, no warping, no structural failures. No nails, no screws, no metal brackets of any kind. No glue. The entire structure is held together exclusively by hand-carved wooden pegs and interlocking joinery so precise that engineers have spent over a century studying it. 33 steps to the top, exactly 33. The age of Christ at the crucifixion. Also the highest degree attainable in Scottish Rite, Freemasonry. Whether you find that meaningful or coincidental, I will leave that to you. But it does suggest whoever built this staircase was counting. Here is a detail that ends arguments. When the timber experts later analyzed the wood, decades after it was built, they found something impossible. The species of spruce used in the construction doesn't exist in New Mexico. Doesn't exist in the American Southwest. The closest botanical match to the cellular density and grain profile that the wood is a rare subspecies found in northern Europe and the subalpine forests of Israel. A lone man on a donkey rode into Santa Fe in 1878 with a hammer and a saw. He left behind tons of ancient European lumber with no transport record, no purchase order, no supply chain. And the staircase that structural engineers still can't fully figure out. Secular investigators eventually pointed to a French woodworker named Francois Jean Rocas, Frenchie, who lived in New Mexico at the time and was mentioned in an obituary as the builder. He was unalived in his cabin in 1895. His tools matched. But even if Rocas built it, Rocas was a standard carpenter. Nobody had ever explained how a rogue craftsman alone, with hand tools in a locked room, calculated the load-bearing physics of a double helix spring staircase. A design that modern engineering firms still study with fascination. The math required to do what was done in that chapel exists, but didn't exist in 1878, and it certainly didn't exist in the hands of one man on a donkey. If the Loretto staircase is the pinnacle of mystery individual, Edward Leedskynen is its patron saint. Ed was a Latvian immigrant. He stood 5 feet tall and weighed just over 100 pounds. He was a quiet, and in between 1923 and 1951, working entirely alone, mostly at night, without electricity or heavy machinery. He quarried, carved, and constructed over 1,100 tons of oolite limestone coral into a fortress. His name for it was Coral Castle. The stones ranged up to 30 tons apiece. The center of gravity calculations required to move them, to swing them, to stack them, to rotate them are not trivial. They are not something you figure out in your garage. And yet, Ed's visitors who attempted to watch him work through fence gaps at night reported something that every serious researcher into this site eventually comes back to. They didn't see Ed straining. They didn't see him with levers and pulleys and primitive cranes. They saw him singing a low, sustained, rhythmic note, his hands flat against the stone, and then the stone rising, not dragged, not levered, rising. They said, like a helium balloon, allowing Ed to steer it gently into position with his fingertips. Ed left behind a handwritten booklet called Magnetic Current. In it, he claimed that modern science was fundamentally wrong about electricity, that magnetism was physical fluid substance flowing through the earth, and that by harnessing this specific interaction between North and South Pole magnet currents in the bedrock, he could temporarily sever a stone's gravitational bond with the earth. He never gave a clearer explanation than that. When people asked him how he moved the stones, he said, "I have discovered the secrets of the pyramids. Here's a piece of evidence that I find most striking." Ed built a 9-ton revolving gate, a single monolithic block 8 feet tall, set as the entrance to the castle. It was balanced so precisely that a child could push it open with one finger. When the gate stopped working in the 1980s, decades after Ed's death, engineers brought in a crane to inspect it. They removed the stone and found that Ed had drilled a longitudinal hole through the exact center of the 9-ton block. Through the center, he had inserted a metal shaft resting on an old truck bearing. The shaft was the precise center of gravity. A millimeter off in either direction, and the gate doesn't move. It just sits there, a 9-ton obstruction. Ed calculated the center of gravity of a 9-ton irregular stone slab alone at night, using no computers and no instruments beyond what he brought with him in a wheelbarrow. He was not a structural engineer. He was a coral carver with a 5th grade education and a theory about magnets. And he built a thing that stumps engineers to this day. Solomon's Temple and the Silence of Iron. I want to go further back because the template of the impossible builder is not new. It's ancient. The first temple of Jerusalem, and I'm pulling here from the Book of Kings and the Testament of Solomon, a text that reads less like a scripture and more like a very alarming construction logbook. Solomon did not want iron tools used in the building of the temple. This is documented in 1 Kings 6:7, and it states explicitly that the house was built using stones cut and prepared elsewhere, so that no hammer, no axe, no tool of iron was heard on the site while it was under construction. That is the strange architectural restriction. Iron is useful. Iron is how you build things in 957 BCE. You don't voluntarily work without it unless you have a very good reason. The reason, according to the Testament of Solomon, is that Solomon wasn't using human workers for the load-bearing heavy lifting. He was using bound demons, and some of them had a pathological sensitivity to iron. The text reads like a project manager's nightmare. Solomon had a magical ring, the seal of God, given to him by the archangel Michael, and he uses it to conscript a roster of supernatural entities. Each entity is assigned based on their specific elemental properties. Ornea's shape-shifting shadow entity, assigned to the quarries, cuts stone. Onoscales, women with mule legs, spins a massive rope capable of lifting systems. Ephispas, described as a localized violent wind vortex summoned specifically from Arabia for one task, to move a single cornerstone that no human crew could budge. The cornerstone of the entire temple. The stone is moved. The cornerstone is set in absolute silence. And here's what makes this interesting from a material science perspective. At the base of the Temple Mount, you can still see these stones in the western wall tunnels today. These are single limestone blocks weighing over 500 metric tons. 500. For context, a modern heavy lifting crane at full capacity handles around 3,000 tons. But a crane is a machine. In 1957 BCE, the theoretical maximum physical force available to human workers using ropes, levers, and ramp system tops out around 50 tons before the physics simply collapse. Those blocks are there. They exist. They have been measured. The gap between what humans could do and what was done has never been satisfactorily closed by mainstream archaeology. And the temple was built in silence, every stone cut somewhere else and fitted so precisely on site that no adjustment was needed, no hammer, no chisel, no sound, just the weight of impossibly large stone lowering itself onto impossibly precise alignment. Ephippas, being a localized wind vortex, it turns out is a weirdly useful physical description of something that could move a 500-ton block. You just need a lot of it, direct, precise, silent. We don't have anything that does that. In 957 BCE, apparently Solomon did. We've talked about buildings whose math came from somewhere outside human knowledge. Now let's talk about the third category. Buildings that were touched. Because if the first category is about keeping something in, and the second one's about building something impossible, the third one is simply the aftermath. What a physical structure looks like after a non-human entity has passed through it. The answer? Consistently, across cultures and centuries, is it doesn't heal. The Frühkirche, one of the most famous cathedrals in Germany, there is a footprint on the stone floor. It's been there since the late 15th century. The story goes that the architect George von Radesburg made a deal with the devil for construction funding. The devil's one condition: no windows, a dark monument to the abyss, no light of God allowed to enter. The building went up. When it was complete, the devil stood in the entrance foyer to inspect his investment. From that specific vantage point, and only that vantage point, the building's massive internal pillars aligned perfectly to block every single window. The devil saw darkness. He saw his end of the deal honored. He took one triumphant step forward. From that new position, the pillars no longer aligned. Row upon a row of massive stained glass windows blazed with light. He had been tricked. The architect had designed the sight line, the exact angle of deception, into the structure itself. The devil stamped his foot in fury and left. His footprint? Pitch black, permanent, in the shape of a human foot, with a distinct spur at the heel, remains at the stone floor of the Frühkirche entrance to this day, deeply burned in, unscrapable. They've tried. They've kept trying. I want you to understand the material reality of what that means. Stone is not malleable under a foot. A human foot, even a heavy human, leaves no impression in polished stone floor. The thermal energy requires to leave a permanent burn mark in granite from a single footfall is extraordinary. The mark is not carrying, it is the mark is not a carving, it is not a decoration, it was not put there by a stonemason. It is a scar, an exit scar, the physical record of a very bad day for a very old entity. And if the Munich footprint is a single incident contained to one building, the devil's footprints are something else entirely. February 9th, 1855, the country of Devon, England, wakes up after a heavy blizzard to find tracks. Everywhere, hoofprints in the snow, cloven, exactly 4 inches long, 3 inches wide, arranged not in a staggered pattern of a 4-legged animal, but in a perfect single-file line, indicating a bipedal entity walking with unnatural absolute balance. 1 foot directly in front of the other, 8 inches spacing continuous. The trail covered over 100 miles across multiple towns in a single night. Here's what's important to understand about how this trail behaves with respect to human architecture. It did not go around buildings, it did not detour around walls. The tracks would approach a 14-foot brick wall, stop at the base, and reappear on the rooftop above, continuing in an undeviated straight line. On the other side, not over it, just appearing on the other side as if the wall simply wasn't information the entity was processing. In one documented case, the tracks entered a drain pipe 2 inches in diameter, tracked through the interior of the pipe, exited out the other side, 2 inches. Clergy across Devon reached that the Satan had physically walked the county that night, that he had paced its boundaries, measured its dimensions, and filled whatever paperwork one files when is claiming a geographic territory in the name of the infernal. There was no blizzard in the following night. There were no more tracks. Whatever completed its survey that evening had gotten what it came for. Let's go to the Irish coast, to the Hook Peninsula and County Wexford, where the coastline is so brutal and so rocky that for centuries it claimed ships with casual regularity. There is a mansion on this peninsula, Loftus Hall, widely regarded as the most haunted house in Ireland. The story started in 1775. Charles Tottenham lived in the bleak, isolated mansion with his second wife and his daughter from his first marriage, Lady Anne. In winter, the peninsula was almost entirely cut off from the rest of the country. Storms rolled in from the bay with nothing to slow them down. During one of these storms, a ship appeared in the bay. This was not unusual. Ships sought shelter on the peninsula regularly. What was unusual was the man who arrived at the door shortly after. Tall, aristocratic, extremely well-dressed, charismatic in a way that Anne apparently found devastating. He said he was a merchant stranded by the storm and could he please stay. He stayed for weeks. He was charming. He was generous. He played cards with the family every night in the drawing room. And he wasn't a possibly good card player. And Anne fell completely, catastrophically in love with him. Then one evening, she dropped a card. She reached under the heavy oak table to retrieve it, and she looked up. He had taken his riding boots off, and where his feet should have been, two coarse, black, coven hooves, and screamed. The stranger stood up and instead of using the door, instead of doing anything physical, material human being would do when discovered, he became, according to the state's own journals, a localized violent vortex, a ball of fire and sulfur smoke. He went up, not out, not through the door or the window, straight up, through the ceiling, through the roof, leaving a gaping, charred hole in that drawing room to the Irish sky. Here's where the story becomes architectural. The Tottenham family hired carpenters, mason after mason after mason, over subsequent decades. Every time the hole was sealed, timber, plaster, stone, the materials would warp, fracture, or collapse inward. The following night, the builders physically rejected every attempt at repair. The hole in the ceiling where the entity exited remained structurally open, a wound that the building refused to close. Lady Anne did not recover. She went into what her family described as severe psychotic break, unable to eat, unable to communicate, unable to stop waiting. They put her in an upper room in the mansion, the tapestry room, and she sat in a wooden chair, knees pressed to her chest, staring at the window at the bay, waiting for the ship to come back, waiting for him to come back. She died years later, still in that chair. Her body had become so rigidly locked into that fetal position, her muscles so permanently contracted from years of that posture, that the family could not straighten her for a traditional burial. They buried her in a specifically constructed square coffin because she could no longer be unfolded. Now, here is where the coda to this story. Here is a coda to this story. The detail that elevates it from tragic to genuinely eerie. In the late 1800s, the old hall was demolished and rebuilt in a massive neo-Gothic structure that stands today. The centerpiece of the new build was a hand-carved Italian oak granite staircase. Builders commissioned just 3 identical versions of this hyper-complex interlocking design, one for the Vatican in Rome, one for the Grand Saloon of the RMS Titanic, and one for the Lotus Hall. The Vatican is fine. The Titanic is somewhere in the bottom of the northern Atlantic. And the one in the Loftus Hall stands in a building that to this day, visitors described as producing a single consistent sensation in the tapestry room. Not the sound of footsteps, not the smell of sulfur, just a physical pressure, invisible, crushing, a weight on the chest. The exact position of a woman who spent the rest of her life waiting. 2 hours north of Loftus Hall, on a bleak hilltop in the Dublin Mountains, there is a story that runs on almost exactly the same template. Same card game, same dropped card, same revealing discovering under the table. But this one ends differently. Montpelier Hill, 1725. William Connolly, a wealthy Irish politician, decides to build a stone hunting lodge on the summit to save money or to make a point, depending on your interpretation. He uses the stones from an ancient Neolithic passage tomb he found in the site. A tomb thousands of years old, a tomb that was, in every traditional sense, sacred. He tears it apart and builds his lodge out of it. Almost immediately, a freak localized storm, not regional, localized, targeted, rips the wooden roof completely off the structure. The locals take this as an obvious message. Connolly, undeterred, had the roof rebuilt entirely in stone arches. Oppressive, vault-like, more tomb than hunting lodge. By the late 1700s, this building has become the meeting place for the Irish Hellfire Club, a society of aristocratic libertines who treated Satanism as a recreational activity and who would, at their midnight meetings, leave one velvet chair at the head of the table conspicuously empty, filled it with the finest wine, waiting for their patron. On one stormy night, and notice how often this happens on stormy nights, how storm seems to be the formal invitation, a stranger arrived and joined the card game. A player dropped the card, reached under the table, cloven hooves. This time, there was no scream, no exit through the ceiling. This time, there was fire. Immediate, total, structural fire. The building was gutted. When it burned out, the stone vaulted ceilings were made, because stone is stubborn, but it was blackened, coated in an oily, thick soot that centuries of Irish rainfall have been unable to clean. The building stands on the hilltop today as a roofless stone shell. The trees around it don't have birds. The fields within the perimeter of the walls grows nothing. People who leave audio recorders running inside the ruins describe consistently picking up low rhythmic sounds beneath the wind noise, a purring, very deep, very regular, very much like something enormous that is resting and not asleep. Researchers and hikers avoid that site after dark, not because of any formal prohibition, but because of something more instinctive, a feeling described with remarkable consistency by people who've never compared notes. That the emptiness inside those stone walls is not ordinary emptiness, that something is using it. Not visiting, not haunting, residing. Before we get into our final acts, I want to talk briefly about geography, because here's a pattern that emerges when you start mapping these sites. The Sacra di San Michele in Piedmont, Italy. Ancient stone complex built on the peak of a Mount Percherino in the 10th century. Structurally improbable, a massive building carved into a vertical cliff face that 10th century technology had no business accessing, let alone building on. Local history records a hermit named Giovanni Vincenzo, who tried to build a monastery on a nearby hill He kept finding that every night the stones he laid disappeared. He watched one night and found angels carrying his stones across the valley to the top of the mountain. The angels apparently had a preferred location. What's remarkable is the Sacre de Saint Michel sits on a straight line, a perfectly straight geographical line that connects 7 monasteries dedicated to the Archangel Michael. From Skellig Michael on a rock off the coast of Ireland, through Mont Saint Michael in France, through the Sacra, through the sanctuary of Mont Sant'Angelo in southern Italy, through a monastery in Greece, all the way to Stella Maris Monastery in Israel. This line tracks exactly with the sunset in the summer solstice. 7 major religious sites, 7 different countries, 1 straight line, 1 date, 1 entity. You cannot build that line intentionally. The sites were established over 1,000 years. And multiple separate civilizations who had no documented communication about coordinates, the line exists whether or not the builders knew about it. The angels apparently had access to a longer ruler. The Sacra, specifically the foundation stones, the oldest layer of the building, are geologically mismatched. The surrounding mountains is local stones. The oldest foundations are rock type that matches a quarry miles away across a valley at the bottom of a cliff face. No human transport record exists. The quarry is down there. The stones are up here. The cliff is vertical. The angels apparently did their own logistics. Inside the Sacra, the main entrance forces a specific experience. You climb a massive stone staircase cut directly into the mountain. The stairway of the dead, they call it, passing under a 30-meter archway. In near total darkness ascending towards the light, the architecture is designed to simulate a specific sensation. It is not subtle. By the time you reach the top, emerging into blinding illumination, you are gasping. The building is a physical experience of death and ascension, built into stone, repeatable, designed by someone who knew exactly what transition felt like. I want to spend a few minutes on the strangest, most consistent thread running through this research. The testimony of the builders, again and again, across cultures and centuries. We get the same story from the people who constructed these impossible things. The blueprint came across outside. The design arrived in a dream. The geometry was shown to them by something that was not another person. The apprentice pillar at Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, 15th century. A master mason is assigned to carve an impossibly ornate pillar for the chapel being built by the Sinclair family. A pillar so complex, he leaves the country to study classical stonework before attempting it. While he is gone, his apprentice falls into a deep trance, has a dream where a celestial figure shows him in complete detail the finished pillar and guides his hand on how to carve it. The apprentice wakes up and does it, immediately, from memory, without drafts, without measurements, without any of the formal architectural preparation the master considered essential. It is a masterpiece, a column wrapped in 8 colliding dragons, from whose mouths erupts vines of stone vegetation spiraling upward, alive in stone in a way that stone simply should not be. When the master mason returned from Rome and saw what the boy had done in his absence, bypassed century of architectural training through a single external transmission, he killed him. Struck the apprentice with a mallet, unalived him in the chapel. His face is carved in the wall of the Roslin to this day, a stone portrait of the master mason staring across the chapel at the pillar he could not replicate. Staring at the thing he wasn't chosen to make. Here's the other pattern. Modern researchers studying in 213 carved stone cubes that protrude from the arches of Roslin Chapel found something unexpected. The geometric pattern carved into those cubes are Landmine figures. The specific shape that form when sound waves hit a flat surface covered in sand. The patterns made by specific frequencies. The entire interior architecture of Roslin Chapel is a piece of sheet music. The building is frozen sound. Someone carved a specific frequency into the stone ceiling of a 15th century Scottish chapel. And it's still there. A modern acoustic scientist still don't know what note you need to play to make the whole thing ring. Something new, something shown, and an apprentice, the design in a dream. And then a human being unalived him for it. Let's close with one more castle because you deserve a closing argument, and I think this one makes it. Bangar Fort, Rustden, India, 17th century, built by King Madho Singh on land near meditation retreat of a powerful ascetic sorcerer named Baba Balu Nath. The sorcerer gave one permission: you can build here, but the moment the shadow of your palace falls on my sanctuary, the city will cease to exist. A later prince didn't listen, built a tower, the shadow fell. The city was abandoned overnight. The entire population gone. The historians' records offer no plague, no invasion, no natural disaster, just absence. Today, Bangar Fort is legally restricted by the Archaeological Survey of India. No one enters between sunset and sunrise. Not a suggestion, a law. Here's the architectural anomaly that makes the site unlike anything else on this list. The massive stone walls of Bangar are intact. The market columns are standing. The stone gateways are standing. The carved decorative elements are standing. Centuries of monsoons have not brought them down. Every single roofed structure in the fort is roofless. Not because the roofs decayed, not because the structural collapse over centuries, because every time anyone tries to rebuild a roof inside the fort perimeter, and many have tried, and the government has documented the attempts, The new roof spontaneously collapses inward within days. Not the walls, not the columns, not the decorative stone. Just the roof, just a covering, just a thing that would enclose the space and create interior air. Whatever the sorcerer's curse does to this place, it does not want ceilings. It wants the sky to be visible from the inside. I don't know what that means. I've thought about it. I don't really have an answer, but I will tell you that the consistent thread of tonight's episode, from Huska's sealed pit to the Goblin Hall staircase, going nowhere to the Red Coast Butte standing empty, is this. Some structures in the world have a purpose that was never ours. Some foundation contains things that the builders understood very well and have politely agreed to forget. And the most unsettling version of that reality isn't the haunted house. It isn't the cursed bridge. It isn't the demonic footprints burned into the cathedral floor. It's the castle with no kitchen. The perfectly ordinary looking building where the heaviest walls face inward. Where the architecture answers a question no one on the tourist brochure is willing to ask out loud. What are we keeping in? The research for this episode brought me to a quote I've been thinking about since I found it. Not from a grimoire, not from an occult text, but from architectural theorist Louis Kahn, who said, "The structure is the giver of light." He meant it technically. He meant that the way a building is assembled creates the conditions for how light enters a space. But I keep thinking about it differently after this episode. The structure is a giver of light. That doesn't mean when the structure was designed to keep everything out. What does a building give you when it was built with no windows, no exits, no room for anything to enter from above? What does it give you when it was built specifically because something needed to be below it, in the dark, and the builders were sophisticated enough to know that stone alone wasn't enough? They painted the things on the chapel walls. They named them in the frescoes left-handed archers, bound beasts, the geometry of submission. They were telling it something they were speaking to it in the only language they could trust to read. The architecture, permanent, immovable, stone saying, you are here, you are below, you stay. 750 years later, the castle is still standing. The scratching continues, and somewhere in the Czech Republic, 80-year-old explosives are the thing standing between a team of geologists and the answer that people who built that chapel in 1278 did not want anyone to find. Maybe they were right. Maybe some basements should stay sealed. Or maybe, and this is the version that keeps me up at night, the scratching isn't the sound of something trying to get out. Maybe it's the sound of something patient, something that has been in the dark for a very long time, that built civilization to entertain itself while it waited. That gave the math for impossible staircases and impossible arches and impossible walls to a handful of human throughout history. just to see what we do with it. And that is down there right now, in the dark, beneath the Gothic chapel floor, beneath the sealed pit, beneath the Nazi landmines, counting, not the seconds, the footsteps of everyone who's walked overheard. Every single one. That is this episode. I'm your host. This has been the Phantom Navigator. The show notes for this episode include source citations, location links, and a specific grimoire text referenced tonight. Read them during the day. See you on the other side.